You're listening to Crosscurrents from KALW News. I'm Hana Baba.
6 days of rioting in a Negro section of Los Angeles left behind scenes reminiscent of war-torn cities. More than 100 square blocks were decimated by fire and looters, and few buildings were left intact.
In the summer of 1967, more than 150 riots broke out in black communities across the country, protesting racial injustice. President Johnson then called a special commission to investigate. The report, called the Kerner Report, analyzed the reasons why black communities were frustrated and rising up. It was groundbreaking. It gave recommendations for solving issues like housing, education, and policing. Its findings were striking for the times, concluding that white society had denied opportunity to black Americans living in poor urban neighborhoods. So today, as the Kerner Report turns 50, how far has the country come in regards to racial justice? This week, scholars from around the country are at UC Berkeley to explore that question at a conference called Race and Inequality in America, the Kerner Commission at 50. Joining me is Stephen Menendian. He's assistant director at UC's Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society, which is hosting the conference. First, I asked him what was happening at the time of the report.
What happened in 1967 was there were a series of police encounters across the country. What usually happened in each of these cases was that there was a young African-American male who was shot, arrested, whatever, by the police. The most serious incidents happened in Detroit and Newark. But one of the incidents that I think is probably the most revealing was in Tampa, Florida. And in Tampa, there was a 19-year-old black man named Martin Chambers who was with a few other people. There was a nearby report that a camera supply store had been broken into, and police saw Martin and some of his friends running away from the scene, and so they pursued. And there was a fence line that Martin was walking along when he was shot in the back by the police officer. And the officer testified that Martin was running and that he shot him because he felt like if he didn't shoot him, he would have escaped. And the problem was that Martin's hands were, when he was shot, up in the fence, facing, shot in the back. And so his friends felt like that he was raising his hands were up to surrender. And stop me if this sounds familiar.
I'm listening to the story. It seems it could be in the news right now, today.
And I appreciate you saying that, because this is what we're dealing with. 50 years ago, it's the same stories that we're telling ourselves, that we're hearing in the news, that we're seeing in the media. And of course, it's the same narrative too, where the police said, he was running, he wasn't surrendering, the same kind of dynamic. And then there's another story, right? And the rumor quickly spread that his hands were up, he was trying to surrender. Why was he shot? Why did that have to happen? So Martin was taken to the hospital and he died. Martin Chambers, 19-year-old black man. These are the stories that you see over and over again in the Kerner Report. And so what the Kerner Report did was, after 9 months of investigation, which included meeting with community members, interviewing witnesses, interviewing people involved in the uprisings across the country, there were 30 or so that were considered really serious. And they all happened kind of in the long, hot summer of 1967. And there were all kinds of incidents. So there were motorists who were pulled over. In Detroit, there were 2 Vietnam veteran servicemen who were coming home. And there was a party that was held to welcome them. There were about 80 people in what's called a blind pig, which is kind of an after hours, not entirely legit place. And the police raided it. And what you had was, these immediate incidents, but underneath them were years, if not decades, of resentments, of painful harassment and disrespect, and a feeling, in a sense, in these communities that the police didn't respect or serve these communities, even when they were trying to protect them from crime. And so these were what the report called the trigger, the inciting incident. And in the report, it profiled many of the cities in detail what happened. And then it did a kind of demographic statistical analysis of what unemployment, housing conditions, discrimination, so on and so forth. And then it employed people like John Hope Franklin, an eminent historian, Dr. Kenneth Clark, who was a social scientist who wrote a study that was used by the Supreme Court in the famous Brown decision. So it brought together these people from different walks of life, different parts of society to come together to produce a real blockbuster report. We forget this now, but the report sold 6 million copies in 1968. It was the hottest selling book since The Valley of the Dolls over a year before.
So it was available to the public. Why was that?
Well, the report was aimed at the public. The commission felt that to really make a difference, to stop this from happening again and again, to stop this kind of cycle of uprising and resentment and frustration and discrimination, they had to produce a report that was aimed at, frankly, mainstream white audiences, to galvanize them, to kind of shake them from their apathy, to say, if you don't do something about this, this is going to happen again and again. And it was a warning, and they blamed white society. They said in the report, in the kind of the most famous statement, they said that our society is moving to two societies, one black, one white, separate, unequal, and that white institutions condone this, they created it, and they supported it. So it was a direct attack on white racism and white institutional racism in 1967.
How did that go over?
A little bit of a leading question. Unfortunately, it ran into the teeth of the political moment in 1968. So what happened in 1968 was not just the war in Vietnam souring the public mood on the Great Society and Lyndon Johnson, but actually the campaigns of Richard Nixon and George Wallace. And by the way, if you go look at George Wallace's statements and the campaign trail in 1968, we think of George Wallace as being the kind of segregationist 1964 Dixiecrat. But in 68, he had kind of modified his tone. And he wasn't targeting the South. Instead, Wallace was going into the industrial heartland. The state he nearly won was Michigan. He was in Wisconsin. He was in Pennsylvania. Stop me if this sounds familiar. And, and Wallace was talking in kind of this just barely coded language about, really about race in America in this industrial heartland. And so was Nixon. But Nixon was on a platform of law and order that really grew out of the incidents of 1967. So in a sense, Nixon ran against the Kerner Commission because Lyndon Johnson resigned, didn't resign, but he decided not to run. So not only was there no longer a benefactor to the Kerner Commission, but the politics of the mood of the country swung in a very different direction.
So familiar, again, all of this that you're talking about. So tell me about some of the recommendations of the Kerner report.
The recommendations are remarkable. They're really incredible. When you look at the recommendations, you would think the reputation of the Kerner Commission is that it asks for diversity in police forces, that it asks for some investment in education. But really what it did was ask for dramatic and immediate investments in marginalized and disadvantaged communities. It wanted 2 million new jobs, 1 million public sector, 1 million private sector over the next 3 years, 600,000 new affordable housing units supported by the federal government. It called for universalizing pre-K. It called for the long-term development of a universal basic income.
That's really progressive for that time.
Well, you know what the commission said about that? It was an old idea. They said that Senator Robert Taft proposed it in 1949. So it seems like a fresh idea to us. It wasn't even fresh to them. And yet it's so timely today, right? So isn't that interesting that we go through these cycles of thinking about these policies, and now it seems incredibly prescient. It seems like this is the moment to consider that. I'll tell you one that I was really blown away by. In Chapter 11 on the policing report recommendations, it said that the police need to stop immediately, end the policy of, quote, stop and frisk. This is 45 years before a federal judge said that stop and frisk was unconstitutional. So this is the way that I think about the Kerner recommendations, is that it's a roadmap for a third Reconstruction. It's a roadmap for change that we didn't take.
My fellow Americans, We have endured a week such as no nation should live through, a time of violence and tragedy. For a few minutes tonight, I want to talk about that tragedy, and I want to talk about the deeper questions that it raises for us all.
This is Crosscurrents. I'm Hana Baba, and that's President Lyndon B. Johnson addressing the nation after the so-called long, hot summer of 1967, after riots erupted in black communities around the country. Johnson appointed a special commission called the Kerner Commission to investigate the reasons why these communities were rising up. Let's get back to my conversation with Stephen Menendian, Assistant Director of Berkeley's Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society, which is hosting the conference Kerner at 50. We heard about the report's recommendations, so what happened after that?
I think what happened was, that it ran into the, foreign wars abroad and political kind of exhaustion at home. And I think it's the two together. In 1967, it was Vietnam. Today, it's Iraq, Afghanistan, you name it. And so what the Kerner Commission said is, look, we're spending $1 trillion in Vietnam. If we could spend a tenth of that, just a tenth of that at home, we could solve all these problems. We could end poverty as we know it. And so they debated whether to put price tags next to it, but they decided not to. And when the report came out, President Johnson was kind of at the end of his road, and so he wanted to bury it. But it sold 6 million copies in a few months. And here's what happened. Martin Luther King was shot and killed on April 4th, 1968. One of the recommendations was implemented, a fair housing law, open housing law, which is one of the recommendations. But it took the death of MLK for that to happen. And very few of the recommendations have actually ever since been implemented. And then a few months after MLK's death, Robert Kennedy was shot and killed. So the dynamics of the 1960s were very different than today. There was a kind of idealistic optimism that we could solve these problems that maybe we'll rekindle again.
Why did you decide to do Kerner at 50?
Well, when Trayvon Martin was murdered, and then you had the Michael Brown murder and Eric Garner and Freddie Gray, we thought, we've seen this story before. Not just, the 1992 LA Rodney King, but we've seen it in a systematic way, not just at a one-off. Where did we see it? We saw it in 1967. And the Kerner report really dealt with that. Now, the Kerner report came out before the kind of systems of mass incarceration were really put in place. But all the other structural elements of racial inequality, housing segregation, employment discrimination, occupational segregation, educational segregation, all these things, income inequality, they all were there. They're all present at the kind of the nucleus of what the Kerner report was about. So we thought there is a historical resonance, there's a historical parallel here that's so powerful that part of the story we have to tell isn't just how do we confront the current moment, but really why is it that when Americans have tried to confront these issues before, even in a powerful, poignant way like the Kerner report, they haven't quite succeeded. So it's not just enough to come up with a comprehensive policy agenda or sets of innovative, creative prescriptions, but it's also about how do we overcome this politics of racial anxiety and racial resentment, and this kind of, which is galvanized by demagogues like Richard Nixon or George Wallace or Donald Trump. Now, how do we deal with that? Because there are 100 recommendations in the Kerner report, and we could take half of them. And if we implemented them today, we would have tremendous progress. So we don't need to come up with necessarily new solutions. What we have to do is figure out a way to implement the ones that exist. That's really why the 50th anniversary matters. Not because of the policy prescriptions, but because it allows us to directly confront the why it was never implemented.
The very first session is about how far we have gotten. What is it called? 1968 to 2018. What's changed and what hasn't? If you were to say in a couple of words, overall, what's changed and what hasn't?
Things have gotten much worse and things have gotten much better. So, there was a report in the New York Times that black unemployment is the lowest it's been ever. But black unemployment is still double white unemployment, which is the same story in 1967. Educational attainment, African Americans have college degrees and high school graduations at rates that far exceed 1967. Mass incarceration, far worse than 1967. So there's progress and retrenchment. Racial segregation, according to some measures, is not as bad as 1967, 1970, but it's still very bad. We're still a very segregated society. Interracial marriage is a big change. We've become a much more diverse country since 1967. But the experiences of poor African Americans in the United States are in many ways just as bad as 1967. Their access to opportunity, the unique exposures and environments in extremely disadvantaged neighborhoods, which Robert Sampson's going to talk about in his keynote, is just as bad as 1967 in many respects, just as harmful to opportunity and upward mobility. So there's kind of an arc of progress, but also a kind of two-step forward, one step back dynamic.
What area are you most optimistic about? Is it criminal justice? Is it economic justice? Is it housing? Is there any area that you really feel a change can be made?
I'll say two areas. One is criminal justice reform. At the state level, we are finally beginning to understand how issues like bail reform and fines and fees lock people into cycles of poverty, and how minor infractions, things you would think aren't even criminal at all, lead to felony warrants. So for example, a no-show for a minor traffic violation or fine or fee does lead to no-show warrants and then possibly felony convictions. Trapping people, right, who are already disadvantaged or poor to begin with. I think there is now a national understanding that at the state and local level, that has to change. It can't just be federal. Even if you ended the war on drugs today and emptied out all the federal prisons from people who are convicted of offenses under the drug war, you would still have mass incarceration in the United States. It's not enough. And it's because of things that are happening at the state and local level. Federal prisons are a fraction of the total amount of people incarcerated, about 15%. So people are getting it now. Bail reform, pretrial detention, licensing issues, fees and fines, those are all areas that can be reformed at the local level, at the state level. And they have a tremendous impact on people's lives. So I'm hopeful of that. Also housing. How do we connect people to jobs even when they're living in segregated environments? So those are things that are being really thought about in creative, novel ways. I'm hopeful in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll have strong solutions here in California and the Bay Area to solve those issues.